The rain hammered against Marcus Chen's windshield like bullets of ice, each drop exploding into fractals of light before being swept away by wipers that squeaked their protests into the storm. His construction truck groaned as it climbed the winding mountain road, its headlights carving weak tunnels through the darkness that seemed to swallow everything beyond 20 feet. The radio crackled with static and fragments of emergency broadcasts, flash flood warnings, road closures, power outages spreading across 3 counties like dominoes falling in slow motion. Preparing and narrating this type of story took as long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Marcus's calloused hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he squinted through the deluge. Somewhere behind him, tucked safely in his modest apartment, his 8-year-old daughter Emma was probably curled up with her worn copy of Charlotte's Web, reading by the light of battery-powered lanterns he'd set up before leaving for this emergency job. The Riverside Medical Center's foundation had shifted during the afternoon's torrential downpour, and as the lead foreman for Chen Construction, a company that bore his name but employed only him and 2 part-time workers, he couldn't afford to let the contract slip away to one of the larger firms circling like vultures. The truck's engine coughed, a wet sound that made Marcus's stomach clench. He'd been nursing it along for 3 months now, feeding it oil and prayers in equal measure, knowing that a major repair would mean choosing between fixing his livelihood and paying Emma's school fees. Single parenthood was a tightrope walk over an abyss of financial ruin, and he'd been balancing on that wire for 4 years now, ever since Sarah's cancer had taken not just his wife, but their savings, their plans, their certainty about tomorrow. A flash of movement in his peripheral vision made him slam on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt just as a figure stumbled into his headlight beams. A young woman in a torn evening dress, her dark hair plastered to her skull, one shoe missing, blood streaming down her left leg. She raised her hand to shield her eyes from the glare, swaying like a reed in a hurricane. Marcus killed the engine and bolted from the cab, his work boots splashing through puddles that reflected the storm clouds like mirrors of liquid obsidian. "Hey, are you okay?" he shouted over the wind, but she was already collapsing, her knees buckling as consciousness flickered behind her eyes like a candle in a storm. He caught her just before she hit the asphalt, his arms sliding under her shoulders and knees. She was lighter than Emma, all sharp angles and delicate bones, her skin pale as porcelain except for the angry purple bruise blooming across her forehead. Her evening gown, what remained of it, was the kind of silk that cost more than Marcus made in 6 months, its champagne color now stained with mud and blood and the bitter taste of survival. "Can you hear me?" Marcus asked, his voice gentler now, the same tone he used when Emma woke from nightmares about her mother's hospital bed. The woman's eyelids fluttered, revealing irises the color of storm clouds, unfocused and fighting to stay open. "My car," she whispered, each word a visible effort. It went over." Marcus followed her gaze down the steep embankment where his headlights caught the glint of twisted metal wrapped around an ancient oak tree. A luxury sedan, Mercedes, maybe BMW, its front end crumpled like an accordion, steam rising from its shattered radiator. The skid marks on the asphalt told the story. She'd taken the curve too fast in the rain, lost control, and somehow managed to crawl up from that wreckage on her own. "Jesus," Marcus breathed. Anyone else would have died in that crash. The fact that she was conscious, let alone walking, spoke to either incredible luck or a stubborn refusal to surrender that reminded Marcus's fierce determination to master multiplication tables despite her dyslexia. Thunder rolled across the mountains like the laughter of giants, and Marcus felt the first prickle of real fear. The storm was worsening, not improving. Cell service had been spotty all day, and up here in the high country, They might as well have been on the moon. The nearest hospital was Valley General, 23 miles down a road that was probably washing out even as he stood there. "What's your name?" he asked, shifting her weight in his arms as he carried her toward his truck. "Sophia," she managed, her head lolling against his shoulder. "Sophia Reed." Reed? The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. There was only one Reed family in the valley with the kind of money that bought silk evening gowns and German luxury cars. Victoria Reed, CEO of Reed Industries, the woman whose construction contracts had built half the commercial district and whose charitable foundation had funded the new children's wing at Valley General. Her daughter would be in her early 20s now, just finishing college or starting her career in the family business. Marcus eased Sophia into the passenger seat of his truck, his mind racing through options like a computer processing data. The main road back to town would be impassable by now. He'd seen the creek bed swelling on his way up, and the low-lying bridges were probably already underwater. But there was another route, an old logging road that switched back and forth down the eastern face of the mountain. It would add hours to the journey and require walking the final stretch, but it might be their only chance. "Stay with me, Sophia," he said, cranking the engine. It turned over reluctantly, coughing black smoke into the storm. "I'm going to get you help." She nodded weakly, her eyes closing again. In the dashboard's green glow, she looked impossibly young and fragile, a fairy tale princess who'd wandered too far from her castle. Marcus thought of Emma, safe and warm in their apartment, probably asleep by now with her books scattered around her like protective talismans. If something happened to him out here, who would take care of his daughter? Who would read her bedtime stories and help with homework and chase away the monsters that lived in the shadows of her mother's memory? But there was no choice. He couldn't leave another father's daughter to die in the storm, not when he had the power to do something about it. That was the difference between surviving and living. The willingness to act when action mattered most, even when the cost might be everything you had left to lose. The truck lurched forward into the night, carrying its unlikely passengers toward an uncertain destination. Behind them, Sophia's wrecked car settled deeper into the embrace of the oak tree, its hazard lights blinking like a lighthouse, warning of dangers already past. Ahead lay 23 miles of treacherous mountain roads, a young woman fighting for consciousness, and the beginning of a story that would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. In Marcus's phone, a cell phone buzzed once with a text from Emma. "Dad, are you safe? The news says there are floods. I love you." He couldn't reach it while driving, couldn't respond to ease her worry. All he could do was grip the wheel tighter and promise himself that he would make it home to her, no matter what the night demanded of him. The storm raged on, indifferent to human plans and dreams and the small acts of courage that sometimes grow into legends. Marcus Chen had learned to measure his life in small victories and careful compromises. Each morning began at 5:30 a.m. with the sound of his ancient coffee maker gurgling to life, a ritual as sacred as prayer in the dim quiet of their apartment. He would stand at the kitchen window, watching the sun paint the mountains gold while the coffee brewed, mentally cataloging the day ahead, which job sites needed his attention, which bills demanded payment, which of Emma's needs took priority over his own dwindling wants. The apartment itself was a testament to creative poverty. 2 bedrooms in a complex that had seen better decades, where the heating worked sporadically and the neighbors' arguments bled through walls thin as tissue paper. But Marcus had transformed their small space into something approaching magic through sheer force of love and determination. Emma's bedroom was a galaxy of glow-in-the-dark stars he'd installed on the ceiling, each constellation telling a story they'd invented together. Her bookshelf, built from salvaged construction materials, treasures collected from garage sales and library book fairs, an encyclopedia of dreams that costs less than $50 total. The living room doubled as Marcus's office, his drafting table wedged between the couch and television, blueprints and invoices organized in cardboard boxes labeled in Emma's careful 8-year-old handwriting. Dad's important papers, bills to pay, dreams for later. That last box held the sketches and plans for Chen Construction's future. The bigger office, the expanded crew, the commercial contracts that would lift them from survival to stability. But those dreams felt as distant as stars on this storm-lashed night as Marcus navigated the treacherous mountain roads with Sophia Reed unconscious in his passenger seat. The truck's heater wheezed warm air that smelled of antifreeze and determination, and every few minutes he would glance over to make sure she was still breathing, still fighting whatever internal battles kept her tethered to consciousness. His mind drifted to Emma's morning routine, the way she insisted on making her own breakfast, even though her scrambled eggs inevitably turned to rubber, and her toast emerged either pale as parchment or black as coal. She approached each failure with the same fierce concentration she brought to everything else, tongue poking out slightly in concentration, dark eyes narrowed with focus that reminded him so much of Sarah it sometimes took his breath away. Emma had been 4 when her mother died, old enough to understand that Mommy was sick, but too young to grasp the permanence of forever. She'd asked for months when Mommy was coming home from the hospital, and Marcus had answered with the same careful honesty their grief counselor recommended. Mommy can't come home, sweetheart, but she's still with us in here, touching his heart, and here, touching hers. Eventually, Emma had stopped asking, but sometimes Marcus caught her having conversations with empty chairs or setting an extra place at their small dinner table, as if love could resurrect the dead through sheer force of will. The single parenting had been a crash course in everything he'd never imagined needing to know. Hair braiding, hours of YouTube tutorials and frustrated tears before he could manage a passable French braid for school picture day. Period talk preparation. He'd already checked out 3 library books on the subject, storing them in the Dreams for Later box because 8 felt too young, but he knew the conversation was coming faster than he was ready for. Parent-teacher conferences where he sat alone among couples, trying to be both cheerleader and disciplinarian, both soft place to land and firm foundation to stand on. Some mornings, the weight of it all felt crushing. He would stand in the shower, water cascading over shoulders that carried the physical burden of construction work and the emotional weight of raising a daughter alone, and wonder if he was failing her in ways he couldn't even see. Was he too strict? Too lenient? Did she need a woman's guidance for things he couldn't even identify? When she asked why other kids had moms and she didn't, his heart would crack a little more, the fault lines of grief spreading deeper with each impossible question. But then there were the moments that made every sacrifice worthwhile. Emma's face when she finally mastered a math concept that had been eluding her for weeks. The way she would curl up next to him on the couch for their Sunday movie marathons, her small hand finding his during the scary parts. Her fierce loyalty when other kids made fun of her secondhand clothes, or the fact that her dad picked her up from school in a dusty construction truck instead of a minivan like everyone else's mothers. "My dad builds things that last forever," she told one particularly cruel classmate. "What does your dad do that matters?" Marcus had heard about the incident from Mrs. Patterson, Emma's teacher, and the pride had nearly choked him. His daughter was growing up strong and kind and brave, despite, or perhaps because of, the circumstances that had shaped her young life. She was learning resilience in ways her classmates never would, finding joy in simple things that others took for granted. Their evenings together had become sacred time. After homework was finished and dinner dishes were washed, they would sit at the kitchen table under the warm glow of the overhead light, the one fixture in the apartment that never flickered or failed, and Emma would tell him about her day while he sketched ideas for new projects or reviewed contracts. She had appointed herself his assistant bookkeeper, carefully writing out invoices in her neat cursive and filing them in the appropriate boxes. "When I grow up," she had announced one evening, looking up from a stack of receipts she was organizing by date, "I want to build things with you. We can be Chen and Chen Construction." The memory brought tears to Marcus's eyes as he downshifted around a hairpin turn, Sophia stirring restlessly in the seat beside him. His phone buzzed again with another text from Emma, and guilt twisted in his chest like a knife. She was probably lying awake now, watching the storm through her bedroom window and wondering why he wasn't home yet. He'd promised to help her with her science project this weekend, a working volcano that required careful engineering and patience he wasn't sure he possessed. That was the constant juggling act of single parenthood, being present for every scraped knee and math test and bedtime story, while also earning enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on their table. There were no sick days when you owned your own business, no backup when childcare fell through, no partner to tag in when exhaustion made your bones feel like lead and your patience wear thin as tissue paper. But somehow, they had built a life together that worked. Not perfect, not easy, but filled with love and laughter and the kind of deep trust that only comes from weathering storms together. Emma knew that her dad would always come home, would always choose her over anything else that demanded his attention. She understood, in the way children instinctively do, that love sometimes looks like sacrifice, and that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear work boots and kiss scraped knees and read bedtime stories in funny voices until the nightmares fade. Now, driving through the worst storm in decades with an injured stranger who might not survive the night, Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. But this time it wasn't just Emma counting on him, it was another father's daughter, another family's world that hung in the balance. And despite the fear gnawing at his gut, despite the voice in his head whispering all the ways this could go wrong, he knew he would do whatever it took to see them both safely home. The truck crested another hill, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the valley far below, its lights twinkling like earthbound stars through the sheets of rain. Somewhere down there, Emma was waiting for him. Somewhere else, the Reed family was probably discovering their daughter was missing, their evening of celebration turned to nightmare by the capricious cruelty of weather and physics. Two families, two daughters, one storm-lashed mountain between safety and disaster. Marcus pressed the accelerator a little harder and whispered a prayer to whatever gods watch over fathers trying to do right by the children in their care. The logging road appeared in Marcus's headlights like a scar across the mountainside, barely more than 2 tire tracks separated by a spine of weeds and loose gravel. He'd used this route once before, 3 years ago, when a late-season snowstorm had closed the main highway and Emma had been running a fever that wouldn't break. That night, desperation had made the choice for him, the same desperation that gripped him now as Sophia's breathing grew more labored and her skin took on the waxy pallor that spoke of internal bleeding and time running out. "I have to stop here," Marcus said aloud, though he wasn't sure if Sophia could hear him. Her eyes had been closed for the past 20 minutes, and twice he'd had to shake her shoulder gently to elicit a groan that proved she was still fighting. "Walk?" Her eyes fluttered open, revealing eyes that struggled to focus in the dashboard's green glow, the single word carrying the weight of impossibility. Marcus killed the engine and turned to face her fully. In the sudden silence, broken only by rain hammering the roof like impatient fingers, he could see the full extent of her injuries more clearly. The gash on her forehead had stopped bleeding, but left dried streaks down the left side of her face like tears of rust. Her left shoulder sat wrong, probably dislocated in the crash, and the way she favored her right side suggested broken ribs that could puncture a lung if she moved too quickly.
"I know it sounds impossible," Marcus said, reaching across to squeeze her uninjured hand. Her fingers were cold as winter stone, her pulse fluttery as a trapped bird. "But it's 5 miles down this trail to the ranger station. From there, we can call for help, get you to a hospital." 5 miles? Sophia repeated, each syllable a monumental effort. "I can barely sit up." Marcus had already considered this, had run the calculations in his head like an engineering problem with no good solutions. Carry her, and they might make 2 miles before his back gave out, leaving them both stranded in the wilderness as the storm worsened. Leave her here and hike alone for help, and she might not survive the wait. Hypothermia and shock were already setting in, her body's internal systems beginning the slow shutdown that preceded death. But there was a third option, one that would test every limit of endurance he'd built through 20 years of construction work and 4 years of single parenthood. "I'm going to carry you," he said simply. Sophia's laugh was bitter as broken glass. "You can't carry a grown person 5 miles. It's impossible. I carried you from your car to my truck. I carried my daughter up 4 flights of stairs every night for 3 months when she had pneumonia and couldn't breathe lying flat. I carried my wife up those same stairs when the cancer made her too weak to walk. Don't tell me what's impossible." The words came out harder than he'd intended, edged with frustration and fear and the bone-deep weariness that came from years of doing impossible things because the alternative was unthinkable. Sophia's eyes widened, and for a moment, Marcus saw past her injuries and exhaustion to the intelligence underneath. Sharp as a blade, calculating odds and possibilities with the precision of someone trained to run boardrooms and balance budgets. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" Marcus was already reaching into the truck's extended cab for his emergency kit. Water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit that had seen better days, and the wool blanket Emma had insisted he keep there, just in case. As he worked, his hands moving with the efficiency of long practice, he thought about her question. "Because that's what people do," he said finally. "They help each other. They don't leave people behind." He wrapped the blanket around Sophia's shoulders, noting how she shivered despite the truck's lingering warmth. Hypothermia was setting in faster than he'd hoped. They had maybe 2 hours before her body temperature dropped to dangerous levels, and that was assuming the internal bleeding wasn't as bad as he feared. The first mile was deceptively manageable. Marcus had positioned Sophia in a fireman's carry, her weight distributed across his shoulders and upper back in a way that engaged his strongest muscle groups. The trail switchbacked down through Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, their branches providing some shelter from the worst of the rain. His work boots found purchase on the wet stone and decomposing pine needles, and his breathing settled into the steady rhythm he'd learned during his brief stint in the Army Reserve. In through the nose, out through the mouth, each breath a small victory over exhaustion. Sophia drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling questions about where they were going, sometimes slipping into what sounded like fragments of business meetings or college lectures. During her lucid moments, she would apologize for the wait, for the trouble, for bleeding on his work shirt. Marcus found himself talking to her, partly to keep her awake and partly to distract himself from the growing ache in his shoulders and lower back. "Tell me about yourself," he said as they navigated a particularly steep section where loose rocks threatened to send them both tumbling into the darkness below. "What do you do when you're not driving German sports cars off mountainsides?" "I'm supposed to take over my mother's company," Sophia replied, her words slightly slurred but understandable. "Reed Industries, construction mostly, some real estate development." Marcus almost stumbled. Reed Industries had been his white whale for years, the contracts that could transform Chen Construction into one-man operation, into something approaching legitimate success. He'd submitted bids on 6 different Reed projects over the past 3 years. Each proposal crafted with meticulous attention to detail and competitive pricing that left almost no margin for profit. Each rejection had come with the same polite language. "Thank you for your interest, but we have decided to pursue other options." "You're Victoria Reed's daughter," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Guilty as charged." There was something bitter in her voice, an edge that spoke of complications he couldn't begin to understand.
Were you at the charity gala tonight? I don't remember seeing you there. Marcus laughed, a sound without humor that echoed off the canyon walls. I don't exactly move in charity gala circles. I was working late at the medical center when the storm hit. Foundation repair. Small world, Sophia murmured, and then, wait, Chen Construction? You submitted a bid for our downtown renovation project last year. Your mother's company went with Hartley Brothers, Marcus said, adjusting Sophia's position as they reached a relatively level stretch where an old wooden bridge crossed a stream that had swollen to a roaring torrent. The structure looked solid enough, but the sound of rushing water below made his stomach clench with vertigo. Because they were cheaper, and because they had the right connections. Your bid was actually better, more detailed, more realistic about potential problems, but Mom doesn't like taking chances on small contractors. Marcus had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still stung. The Hartley brothers had finished that project 3 months behind schedule and 15% over budget, their work plagued by the exact problems Marcus had identified in his proposal. But they had connections that stretched back generations, family money that could absorb cost overruns, and the kind of social capital that opened doors for handshake deals over golf and cocktails. That's the way the world works, Marcus said, trying to keep the bitterness out of his voice. It's not what you know or how well you do the job, it's who you know and which country club your father belonged to. You sound like you've given this some thought, Sophia observed. 4 years of rejection letters will do that to a person. They were halfway across the bridge now, the wooden planks slick with rain and decades of accumulated moss. Marcus tested each step carefully, acutely aware that a fall here would kill them both. Below, the stream raged with spring snowmelt and storm runoff, carrying debris and fallen trees like battering rams in the darkness. For what it's worth, Sophia said, her voice barely audible over the rushing water, I always argued for giving smaller contractors a chance. Fresh perspectives, hungrier work ethic, and more attention to detail because they can't afford to fail. But your mother disagreed. My mother built her company by minimizing risk and maximizing relationships. It served her well for 30 years, but the world is changing, and sometimes I think she doesn't see it. Marcus felt Sophia's weight shift slightly as she lifted her head to look around. They had cleared the bridge and were descending into a section of trail that wound between massive granite boulders, each one worn smooth by millennia of weather and time. The rain had eased slightly, though the wind still howled through the canyon like a living thing searching for prey. How much farther? Sophia asked. Marcus checked his watch, surprised to find that nearly 2 hours had passed since they'd left the truck. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and the fire in his shoulders had spread down his arms until every muscle screamed for relief. But they had covered maybe 3 miles, which meant they were past the halfway point. 2 miles, maybe a little more. There's a rest area up ahead where we can take a break. The rest area turned out to be a small clearing with a picnic table and a metal fire ring that had seen better decades. Marcus lowered Sophia carefully onto the table's bench, noting how she swayed even while sitting. Her face was gray with exhaustion and pain, her breathing shallow and rapid. When he touched her forehead, her skin was cold and clammy, classic signs of shock setting in. I need you to stay awake, Marcus said, digging an energy bar from his pack and tearing it open. Can you eat something? Sophia shook her head weakly. Nauseous. Just a few bites. Your body needs fuel. He broke off a small piece and held it to her lips. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted it, chewing mechanically. While she ate, Marcus stretched his back and shoulders, trying to work out the knots of tension that threatened to seize up entirely. 2 more miles. He'd carried bags of concrete farther than that, had hauled lumber and steel beams distances that would make a normal person weep. But concrete didn't bleed. Steel beams didn't have fathers who would blame themselves forever if their daughters died in the wilderness. Tell me about your daughter, Sophia said suddenly. Marcus looked up, surprised by the request. Emma? She's 8. Smart as a whip, stubborn as her mother, braver than she has any right to be. What's she like? Marcus found himself smiling despite their circumstances. She wants to be an engineer like her dad,
but she also writes stories about dragons and princesses who save themselves. She makes me pancakes on Sunday mornings that taste like rubber, but I eat every bite because the look on her face when she serves them is worth more than anything money can buy. She asks hard questions about life and death and why some kids have more than others, and somehow she always manages to find the hope in every answer. She sounds incredible. She is. She's the reason I get up every morning, the reason I keep bidding on contracts even when I know the fix is in, the reason I carried you 3 miles through a storm, and I'm going to carry you 2 more. Marcus shouldered his pack again, feeling the familiar ache settle into his bones. Because someday, if she's ever in trouble, I hope some stranger will care enough to do the same thing for her. Sophia was crying now, silent tears that mixed with the rain on her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" "For the contracts, for the way the system works, for all the good people like you who get passed over because they don't have the right connections." Marcus lifted her gently, settling her weight across his shoulders once more. The trail ahead disappeared into darkness, punctuated by the distant glow of what he hoped was the ranger station's emergency lighting. "Don't apologize for the world being broken," he said, starting down the mountain again. "Just help me fix it when we get out of this." The final 2 miles tested every limit Marcus had discovered in himself, his legs cramped with exhaustion, forcing him to stop every few hundred yards to stretch and breathe and convince his body to take one more step. His shoulders had gone numb, the pain transitioning into a kind of distant fire that he could acknowledge but not quite feel. Twice he stumbled and nearly fell, catching himself at the last second and feeling Sophia's body jolt against his back. But he kept walking, driven by something deeper than stubbornness or duty. It was the same force that had carried him through Sarah's illness, through the sleepless nights and mounting medical bills, and the horrible day when the oncologist had run out of options to offer. It was the love that made a man keep fighting when fighting seemed pointless, the refusal to surrender that separated survival from mere existence. When the ranger station's lights finally appeared through the trees, Marcus felt his knees buckle with relief. He managed to stumble up the front steps and pound on the door, his free hand shaking with exhaustion. The ranger who answered, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and the steady demeanor of someone used to midnight emergencies, took one look at them and reached for his radio. "This is Station 7, requesting immediate medical helicopter support," the ranger said into his handset. "I have a female victim, early 20s, possible internal injuries and hypothermia. We'll need a landing zone cleared and medical personnel standing by." Marcus lowered Sophia gently under the station's couch, his body finally allowed to acknowledge the full extent of its exhaustion. She was conscious, but fading, her eyes struggling to focus as the ranger wrapped her in thermal blankets and began taking vital signs. "You carried her how far?" the ranger asked, checking Sophia's pulse. 5 miles, Marcus said, collapsing into a chair that felt like heaven despite its government-issue hardness. The ranger looked at him with something approaching awe. "Son, I've been doing mountain rescue for 25 years and I've never seen anything like that. You just saved this young lady's life." Marcus closed his eyes and thought of Emma, probably asleep now in her bed of glow-in-the-dark stars. He thought of all the impossible things love could make possible, and how sometimes the most ordinary people found themselves capable of extraordinary acts simply because walking away wasn't an option. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease, the wind dropping from a howl to a whisper. In the distance, he could hear the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors cutting through the night, coming to carry them both to safety. The Valley General Hospital's emergency room at 4 a.m. resembled a battlefield triage center more than a medical facility. Storm casualties filled every bed. Car accident victims, heart attack patients who'd been delayed by flooded roads, elderly residents suffering from hypothermia after power outages left them without heat. The fluorescent lights buzzed with harsh efficiency, casting everything in the sickly green pallor of urgency and exhaustion. Marcus sat in a plastic chair that had seen better decades, his work clothes still damp with rainwater and mountain mud, watching through an observation window as a team of doctors and nurses worked over Sophia Reed. She'd been unconscious when the helicopter touched down,
her blood pressure dropping and pulse thready with the onset of severe shock. The flight medic had started 2 IV lines during the 15-minute journey to the hospital, pushing fluids and medications that had stabilized her enough to survive the trip. "Mr. Chen?" A doctor appeared at his elbow, young, Asian American with the intense focus and steady hands that marked her as someone comfortable with crisis. "I'm Dr. Sarah Kim, the trauma surgeon working on Ms. Reed. I understand you're the one who carried her down from the mountain?" Marcus nodded, too exhausted for words. His entire body felt like he'd been hit by a truck, every muscle fiber screaming protests that he'd ignored for too long. But Sophia was alive, and that was what mattered. "She's stable now?" Dr. Kim continued, settling into the chair beside him. 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, significant dehydration and hypothermia, but no internal bleeding that we can detect. Another hour or 2 in those conditions, and we would have been having a very different conversation. She's going to be okay?" "Barring complications, yes. She'll be in the hospital for a few days, but she should make a full recovery." Dr. Kim paused, studying Marcus with curious eyes. "Can I ask why you did it? 5 miles is, well, it's beyond what most people would consider possible." Before Marcus could answer, a commotion erupted near the emergency room entrance. Victoria Reed swept through the automatic doors like a force of nature, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the hour, her charcoal business suit immaculate, and her eyes blazing with the kind of controlled fury that came from watching your child's life hang in the balance. Behind her trailed an entourage, personal assistants, Reed Industries executives, and what looked like a private security team. "Where is my daughter?" Victoria demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. The triage nurse, a woman who'd probably seen every possible variation of family crisis, responded with professional calm. "Mrs. Reed, your daughter is in Trauma Bay 3. Dr. Kim is her attending physician. If you'll have a seat, someone will—" "I don't want to have a seat. I want to see my daughter. Now." Dr. Kim rose from her chair beside Marcus, intercepting Victoria before she could push past the nurse's station. "Mrs. Reed, I'm Dr. Kim. Your daughter is stable and resting comfortably. I'll be happy to take you to her, but I need you to understand that she's been through significant trauma. She needs quiet and rest right now." Victoria's composure cracked slightly, revealing the fear underneath her executive armor. "Is she? Will she?" "She's going to be fine," Dr. Kim assured her. "Thanks to this man." She gestured toward Marcus, who had stood up when Victoria entered, but remained near his plastic chair, acutely aware of how out of place he looked among the Reed family's polished entourage. Victoria turned to study Marcus for the first time, her sharp eyes taking in his muddy work clothes, his exhausted posture, the way his hands shook slightly from adrenaline crash and physical exhaustion. Recognition dawned slowly. She'd seen his face before, on bid proposals and in the brief meetings where she'd politely declined his construction services. "Chen Construction," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "You carried my daughter 5 miles through a mountain storm." "Yes, ma'am." Victoria Reed was a woman who'd built an empire through careful calculation and strategic thinking, who understood leverage and negotiation and the complex dynamics of power. But standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the emergency room, facing the man who'd saved her daughter's life, she found herself utterly without words. Dr. Kim filled the silence. "Mr. Chen found your daughter at the site of her car accident, carried her from his truck when the roads became impassable, and then hiked 5 miles through dangerous terrain in the middle of a storm. I've been practicing emergency medicine for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like it. Without his actions, we would have been conducting a very different conversation this morning." Victoria's eyes never left Marcus's face as she processed this information. Around them, the hospital continued its rhythm of crisis and healing, monitors beeping, pages echoing through corridors, the soft-souled shuffle of nurses moving between patients.
But in that small corner of the emergency room, time seemed suspended as two people from vastly different worlds tried to navigate the aftermath of an impossible night. "Why?" Victoria asked finally, the single word carrying the weight of genuine bewilderment. "You don't know us. You could have been killed out there." Marcus thought of Emma again, probably waking up now to discover he still wasn't home, and felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with being a single parent in crisis. Because that's what you do. You help when someone needs help. Most people would have called for rescue services. Cell service was out. Roads were flooded. By the time help arrived, Marcus shrugged, too tired to elaborate on the obvious conclusion. One of Victoria's assistants, a young man in an expensive suit who'd been hovering at the edge of the conversation, stepped forward. "Mrs. Reed, the media is already picking up on this story. Channel 7 has a news crew in the parking lot, and the newspaper is sending someone. We should probably prepare a statement." Victoria's expression shifted, her executive instincts engaging as she considered the implications. The story was already writing itself. Billionaire CEO's daughter saved by working-class hero. David and Goliath with a happy ending. The kind of human interest narrative that could dominate news cycles for days. There would be interview requests, photo opportunities, the inevitable offers from Hollywood producers looking to option the rights. But as she looked at Marcus, really looked at him, Victoria saw something that made her chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion. He wasn't calculating angles or considering opportunities. He wasn't thinking about what this might mean for his business or his future prospects. He was just a tired man who'd done an extraordinary thing because it needed doing, and now he wanted to go home to his daughter. "No statements," Victoria said quietly, surprising her assistant. "Not yet. First, I want to see Sophia." Dr. Kim led them through the maze of trauma bays to where Sophia lay sleeping, her face pale but peaceful against the white hospital pillows. Monitors tracked her vital signs with steady electronic reassurance, and IV lines delivered the fluids and medications that were slowly bringing her body back from the edge of crisis. She looked impossibly young and fragile, a stark reminder of how close they'd come to losing her. Victoria approached the bed with uncharacteristic hesitancy, reaching out to brush a strand of dark hair from her daughter's forehead. "Baby?" she whispered. Sophia's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus in the bright hospital lighting. When she saw her mother's face, tears began streaming down her cheeks. "Mom, I'm sorry. I was driving too fast. And the rain—" "Shh," Victoria soothed, taking her daughter's hand. "None of that matters now. You're safe." "The man," Sophia said, her eyes searching the room until they found Marcus standing near the doorway. "He carried me. 5 miles. I told him it was impossible, but he did it anyway." Victoria turned to look at Marcus again, and this time her expression held something approaching wonder. "Mr. Chen, I owe you a debt that I can never repay." "You don't owe me anything. I need to get home. My daughter's probably worried sick." "Your daughter," Victoria's voice held a note of recognition. "Emma, isn't it? 8 years old, attends Lincoln Elementary." Marcus stiffened slightly. "How do you know that?" "Because," Victoria said, her voice taking on the tone of someone accustomed to knowing everything about anyone who crossed her path. "I make it my business to know about people who work in my city, especially people who bid on my contracts." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus had been prepared for gratitude, maybe even some kind of reward. He hadn't been prepared for the reminder that he and Sophia Reed lived in completely different worlds. His, transparent as glass. Hers, protected by layers of wealth and information and the kind of power that could peer into anyone's life with casual efficiency. "Then, you also know that I need to get home to her," Marcus said carefully, having his voice neutral. "Dad?" Everyone turned toward the doorway where a small figure stood silhouetted against the bright corridor lights. Emma Chen, all dark hair and serious eyes, wearing her favorite pajamas under Marcus's spare work jacket that hung on her like a tent. Behind her stood Mrs. Patterson, Emma's teacher, looking harried and apologetic. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Patterson said quickly. She called me when you didn't come home. I tried to convince her to wait until morning, but she was beside herself with worry when we heard on the news about a rescue on the mountain." "Dad!" Emma launched herself across the room and into Marcus's arms, her small body trembling with relief and residual fear. "I thought something happened to you. The news said there were landslides and people were missing, and I couldn't call you, and—" "I'm okay, sweetheart," Marcus murmured into her hair, feeling his own eyes burn with exhaustion and emotion. "I'm sorry I scared you. There was an emergency, and I couldn't call." Emma pulled back to study his face, her 8-year-old's instincts reading the exhaustion and stress written in every line. Then she looked around the trauma bay, taking in the medical equipment, the hospital bed, and the elegant woman in the expensive suit who was watching their reunion with an unreadable expression. "Is that the person you helped?" Emma asked, looking at Sophia with the directness that only children possessed. "Yes," Marcus said. "This is Sophia. She was hurt in a car accident." Emma approached the hospital bed with the fearless curiosity of childhood, studying Sophia with the same intensity she brought to science projects and math problems. "Are you okay now?" Sophia managed a weak smile. "I am, thanks to your dad. He's a hero." "I know," Emma said matter-of-factly. "He's always been my hero." Victoria Reed, who had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without blinking and faced down hostile corporate boards with ice-cold precision, found herself struggling to maintain her composure as she watched the interaction between father and daughter. There was something pure in their connection, something uncontaminated by calculation or agenda, that made her think of her own relationship with Sophia when she was Emma's age. Before the business had consumed everything, before success had become the only metric that mattered, before she had lost track of the difference between building something lasting and simply building something bigger. "Mr. Chen," Victoria said, her voice carefully controlled, "would you and Emma join us for breakfast? There's a cafeteria upstairs and I think we have some things to discuss." Marcus hesitated, his natural caution warring with curiosity about what Victoria Reed might want to discuss. Emma solved his dilemma by looking up at him with pleading eyes. "Can we, Dad? I'm really hungry and I want to make sure Sophia's okay." An hour later, they sat around a corner table in the hospital cafeteria as dawn light filtered through tall windows that overlooked the valley. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming under a sky that promised better weather ahead. Emma worked her way through a stack of pancakes, peppering Sophia with questions about her car, her job, and whether she had ever seen a real construction site. Victoria Reed watched the conversation with the bemused expression of someone discovering a foreign culture. When was the last time she had eaten breakfast in a hospital cafeteria? When was the last time anyone had asked her daughter simple, honest questions without an agenda lurking beneath the surface? "Emma," Victoria said during a lull in the conversation, "your father tells me you want to be an engineer." Emma nodded enthusiastically, syrup on her chin. "I want to build things that help people, like hospitals and schools and bridges that don't fall down." "That's a wonderful goal. What's your favorite subject in school?" "Math," Emma replied promptly. "It's like puzzles, but the answers actually matter. Dad helps me with the hard problems." Victoria glanced at Marcus, who was nursing a cup of coffee and trying to stay awake through sheer force of will. "I imagine your father is very good at solving problems."
"The best," Emma said loyally. "He fixed our washing machine with duct tape and a coat hanger. He built my bookshelf out of old wood from a construction site. And last year when Mrs. Rodriguez's roof was leaking and she couldn't afford to fix it, Dad spent his whole weekend making it waterproof again." "Emma," Marcus warned gently, embarrassed by his daughter's enthusiastic catalog of his good deeds. "It's true," Emma protested. "You help people all the time. You just don't make a big deal about it." Victoria set down her coffee cup,
her mind working through calculations that had nothing to do with profit margins or market analysis. "Mr. Chen, I'd like to make you an offer. Reed Industries is expanding our community outreach programs. We need someone to oversee small-scale construction projects, accessibility renovations for elderly residents, playground upgrades for schools in low-income neighborhoods, that sort of thing. The salary would be competitive, and you'd have access to our supplier networks and equipment inventory." Marcus stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance to do what you're already doing, but with better resources and wider impact. Your background check shows community involvement that goes back years, volunteer work at the homeless shelter, pro bono repairs for families in crisis, donations of materials and labor for everything from church renovations to Little League dugouts." Victoria paused, watching his reaction carefully. "Most contractors are in business to make money. You seem to be in business to make a difference. I could use someone like that." "I have my own company," Marcus said slowly, "which you could keep. This would be contract work, not employment. Reed Industries would become your primary client, providing steady income and growth opportunities while you maintain your independence." Emma looked back and forth between the adults, her 8-year-old brain processing the implications with startling clarity. "Dad, that means you wouldn't have to worry about paying the bills anymore." "Emma," Marcus said again, but more gently this time. Victoria smiled at the girl's directness. "She's right, you know. Financial security would give you more freedom to take on the projects that matter to you, rather than just the ones that pay the bills." Sophia had been quiet through most of the conversation, but now she spoke up. "Mom, what about the downtown renovation? The one that's been stalled for 6 months because Hartley brothers can't get their act together?" Victoria's expression darkened slightly. "That's a more complicated situation. There are existing contracts, relationships that go back decades." "Contracts that aren't being fulfilled," Sophia interrupted. "Dad, you've seen Mr. Chen's proposals. You know his work would be superior to what we're getting now. Why not give him a chance to prove it?" "Wait. I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Reed. I really do. But I don't want charity. I don't want to be your feel-good story about the working-class hero who got rescued by the benevolent billionaire. If you're offering me work, it needs to be because you believe I can do the job better than anyone else, not because you feel guilty about your daughter's accident." The directness of his response seemed to surprise Victoria, but after a moment she nodded approvingly. "Fair enough. Let me be clear. I don't do charity when it comes to business. I do what's profitable and sustainable. The community outreach position exists because it serves Reed Industries' long-term interests. Happy communities support development projects. Goodwill translates to smoother permitting processes and fewer NIMBY protests."
"And the downtown renovation?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, weighing considerations that Marcus could only guess at. Political relationships, old friendships, the delicate ecosystem of favors and obligations that kept her business empire running smoothly. Finally, she spoke. "Give me 3 days to review your original proposal and current project timelines. If I can find a way to restructure the contract without creating more problems than it solves, we'll talk. No promises." Marcus extended his hand across the table. "That's all I can ask for." Victoria shook it, her grip firm and businesslike, but her eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there when the conversation began. "Mr. Chen, you saved my daughter's life last night, but more than that, you've reminded me why I got into this business in the first place. Sometimes it takes an outsider to help you see what you've lost sight of." Emma had been following the adult conversation with the intensity of someone watching a tennis match, and now she spoke up with the fearless honesty that only children possessed. "Mrs. Reed, does this mean my dad won't have to work so many late nights anymore?" Victoria looked at the little girl, really looked at her, seeing past the syrup-stained pajamas and tangled hair to the sharp intelligence underneath, the fierce love for her father,
the premature wisdom that came from growing up with less than most of her peers, but more love than money could buy. "I hope so, Emma," Victoria said softly. "I really hope so." Outside the cafeteria windows, the sun climbed higher over a valley that sparkled with rainwater and possibility. In Trauma Bay 3, monitors tracked the steady rhythm of a young woman's recovery. In a modest apartment across town, glow-in-the-dark stars waited to welcome home a little girl who'd spent a sleepless night worrying about her hero. And in the space between what was and what might be, two families from different worlds began to discover that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest act of one human being helping another, no questions asked, no rewards expected, simply because it was the right thing to do. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the doorway of what had once been Chen Construction's cramped apartment office, watching as Emma carefully arranged her homework on a desk that was actually designed for studying rather than bill-paying and blueprint reviewing. The new office space occupied the ground floor of a renovated building in the Arts District, complete with proper filing cabinets, a conference room with actual chairs instead of milk crates, and windows that let in enough natural light to make working past dinner feel less like a descent into purgatory. "Dad, can you check my math?" Emma called from her corner desk, an addition to the office that had been her idea, complete with her own phone line and a nameplate that read, "Emma Chen, Future Engineer." She'd convinced Marcus that every successful business needed someone to handle customer relations, and at 8 years old, she'd proven remarkably effective at charming clients and suppliers with her earnest questions about their work and families. Marcus reviewed her long division problems, noting the careful way she showed each step of her work, the same methodical precision she brought to organizing his project files and updating the client database he'd finally been able to afford. "Perfect, as usual," he said, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. "Are you ready for dinner?" "5 more minutes? I want to finish my story about the princess who builds bridges." The story had been Emma's ongoing project for weeks, a fairy tale where the princess eschewed waiting for rescue in favor of engineering her own solutions to every problem the evil queen threw at her. Marcus suspected the princess bore more than a passing resemblance to Sophia Reed, who had become something of a hero in Emma's 8-year-old worldview. The transformation of Chen Construction from a one-man survival operation to a thriving business with 3 full-time employees and a 6-month project backlog still felt surreal to Marcus. The community outreach contract with Reed Industries had provided the steady income foundation that allowed him to bid on larger projects without risking Emma's college fund. More than financial security, the partnership had opened doors that had been firmly closed before. Suppliers who'd been requiring cash on delivery suddenly offered 30-day payment terms. Subcontractors who'd been too busy for small jobs found space in their schedules. And permits that used to take months now moved through city offices with surprising efficiency. The downtown renovation project had been the breakthrough that changed everything. When Hartley Brothers defaulted on their contract, 6 months behind schedule and facing a lawsuit from the city over substandard work, Victoria Reed had made good on her promise to review Marcus's original proposal. The contract restructuring had taken 2 weeks of intense negotiation, but the result had been Chen Construction's first million-dollar project and the kind of high-profile success that attracted attention from other developers. "Mr. Chen?" His newest employee, Janet Morrison, appeared in the doorway with a stack of invoices and the kind of hesitant expression that meant she had questions. Janet was a recent construction management graduate from the university, eager and competent, but still learning to navigate the gap between textbook theory and real-world problem-solving. "What's up?" Marcus asked, settling into his desk chair that actually supported his back properly instead of threatening to collapse under normal use. "The Lincoln Elementary Playground project, we're ahead of schedule and under budget. Do you want me to add the extra features the principal mentioned, or save the money for contingencies? It was exactly the kind of problem Marcus had dreamed of having during the lean years. Too much success rather than too little. Decisions about how to exceed expectations rather than how to meet minimum requirements. The Lincoln Elementary project was part of Reed Industries' community outreach initiative, a comprehensive playground upgrade that would serve as a model for similar projects throughout the district. Add the features, Marcus decided, but document everything carefully. Mrs. Reed likes to see where every penny goes, especially on the community projects. Janet nodded and headed back to her desk, leaving Marcus to contemplate the strange turns his life had taken since that storm last night on the mountain. The financial security was wonderful, of course, but the real change went deeper than numbers on a bank statement. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he was building something instead of just surviving something, creating a legacy that Emma could be proud of instead of merely ensuring she had food and shelter. The office phone rang, and Emma answered it with her most professional 8-year-old voice. "Chen Construction, this is Emma speaking. How may I help you?" There was a pause, then, "Oh, hi Sophia. Dad, it's for you." Marcus took the call, as he had dozens of times over the past 6 months. Sophia Reed had made a full recovery from her injuries, but their friendship had developed into something neither of them had expected, a connection that bridged the gap between their different worlds through shared values and mutual respect. "How's the star contractor today?" Sophia asked, her voice carrying the kind of warm humor that had emerged during her recovery. The serious, somewhat brittle young woman who'd been driving too fast through a mountain storm had evolved into someone more confident, more comfortable with her own opinions, and less willing to simply echo her mother's business philosophy. "Busy," Marcus replied. "Janet tells me we're ahead of schedule on Lincoln Elementary." "That's great news. Listen, I'm calling because Mom wants to know if you're free for dinner tomorrow night. She has a proposition for you." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with Victoria Reed's propositions. Each one had been more ambitious than the last. First, the community outreach contract, then the downtown renovation, then a partnership agreement that made Chen Construction the preferred contractor for all Reed Industries projects under $5 million. He was grateful for the opportunities, but sometimes he felt like he was riding a rocket ship that might explode at any moment. "What kind of proposition?" he asked carefully. "She wants to discuss the regional expansion plan. Apparently, the mayor of Riverside is very interested in replicating our community outreach model in his city, and Mom thinks you're the person to make it happen." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Regional expansion meant more employees, bigger office space, the kind of growth that could transform Chen Construction from a local success story into something approaching a real company. It also meant more complexity, more risk, and more time away from Emma during the years when she needed him most. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course, but Marcus, Mom's not going to keep offering these opportunities forever. She believes in you, but she's also a businesswoman. If you're not ready to grow, she'll find someone who is." After he hung up, Marcus sat in his office chair, the comfortable one that supported his back, and tried to imagine what Sarah would advise if she were here. She'd always been the dreamer between them, the one who had encouraged him to start his own company instead of working for someone else's vision. But she'd also been fiercely protective of their family time, insisting that success without balance was just another form of failure. "Dad?" Emma appeared at his elbow, her homework finished and her bag packed for their walk home. "You look worried." "Just thinking about work stuff," Marcus said, logging off his computer and reaching for his jacket. The October evening was crisp with the promise of winter, leaves turning gold and red in the maples that line their neighborhood streets. "Is it about the dinner with Mrs. Reed?" Emma asked as they walked. Her capacity for overhearing and understanding adult conversations never ceased to amaze Marcus, though he supposed growing up in a single-parent household had accelerated her emotional intelligence in ways that weren't always age-appropriate. "How did you—" Never mind. "Yes, it's about dinner with Mrs. Reed. She wants you to take on more projects." Something like that. Emma was quiet for several blocks, her small hand warm in his as they navigated the evening foot traffic. Finally, she spoke up with the kind of insight that reminded Marcus why he'd fallen in love with her mother. "Dad, remember when I wanted to join both soccer and violin lessons? But you said I had to choose because doing too many things means not doing any of them well?" Marcus stopped walking and looked down at his daughter, seeing Sarah's wisdom reflected in her serious 8-year-old eyes. "You think I should say no to Mrs. Reed?" "I think you should do what makes you happy. And you're happiest when we have time for pancakes on Sunday mornings, and when you can help Mrs. Rodriguez fix her fence without worrying about missing other work. Money's good, but it's not everything." Out of the mouths of babes, Marcus thought, squeezing Emma's hand as they resumed walking. His 8-year-old daughter had just articulated what he'd been struggling to understand, that success without sustainability was just a more complicated form of failure, and that the best opportunities weren't always the biggest ones. The next evening, Marcus sat across from Victoria and Sophia Reed in the private dining room of the city's most exclusive restaurant, feeling distinctly underdressed despite his best suit. The conversation over dinner had been pleasant but careful, touching on Emma's progress in school, Sophia's new role as Director of Community Development at Reed Industries, and the various projects that had emerged from their partnership. Now, over coffee and dessert that cost more than Marcus used to spend on groceries in a week, Victoria laid out her vision for regional expansion. Charts and projections covered the table like battle plans, each number representing growth potential that could transform not just Chen Construction, but Marcus's entire life. Conservative estimates suggest a 300% increase in revenue within 18 months, Victoria concluded, her presentation as polished and compelling as everything else she did. "We're talking about establishing Chen Construction as the premier community-focused contractor throughout the Pacific Northwest." Marcus studied the numbers, impressed despite himself by the thoroughness of the research and the obvious potential for success. But Emma's words echoed in his mind, about choosing quality over quantity, about maintaining the things that made life worth living. "It's an incredible opportunity," Marcus said carefully, "but I have concerns about scaling up that quickly." "Such as?" Victoria asked, her tone neutral, but her eyes sharp with the kind of focus that had built her empire. "Quality control, company culture, work-life balance." Marcus paused, knowing that his next words might cost him everything Victoria was offering. "Mrs. Reed, I've spent 4 years building a business that allows me to be present for my daughter's childhood. I'm not willing to sacrifice that for any amount of growth." Sophia leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "What if there was a way to expand without compromising those values? What if we could build a model that prioritized sustainability and balance from the beginning?" Victoria looked at her daughter with surprise, then back at Marcus. "What are you suggesting?" "A franchise model," Sophia said, her words gaining confidence as she worked through the idea aloud. "Instead of Chen Construction expanding directly, we help other contractors in other cities replicate the community outreach model that made Chen Construction successful. Marcus provides training and oversight, Reed Industries provides financing and contracts, but the local operators maintain control of their day-to-day operations." Marcus felt something click into place, a solution that honored both ambition and values. Like a network of independent contractors, all working toward the same goals but maintaining their local focus. "Exactly," Sophia said. "You could impact communities throughout the region without losing what makes Chen Construction special." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her mind clearly working through the implications and logistics. Finally, she smiled, the first completely unguarded expression Marcus had seen from her since that night in the hospital. You know, when I was building Reed Industries, I told myself that bigger was always better, that growth was the only metric that mattered. It took almost losing my daughter to remind me that some things can't be measured in quarterly reports. "What are you saying?" Marcus asked. "I'm saying that maybe it's time Reed Industries learned something about sustainable growth from Chen Construction instead of the other way around. Rating she was coffee cup in a toast, to partnerships that prioritize people over profits, and to the crazy idea that doing good and doing well aren't mutually exclusive." As they clinked cups, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The storm-lashed mountain road, the impossible 5-mile hike, and the gradual building of trust and respect between people who should have remained strangers. Sometimes the most important decisions weren't about choosing between good and bad options, but about finding the wisdom to create entirely new possibilities. 3 months later, the franchise model had expanded to include partners in 4 cities, each local contractor trained in the community outreach approach that had made Chen Construction successful. Marcus found himself traveling 1 week per month, conducting training sessions and quality assessments, but always returning home to Emma and their Sunday morning pancake tradition.
The partnership with Reed Industries had evolved too, becoming less about contractor and client and more about collaborators working towards shared goals. Sophia had convinced her mother to implement sustainability metrics alongside profit margins, measuring success not just in dollars earned, but in communities strengthened and families helped. On a snowy December evening, Marcus sat in his office reviewing the year's accomplishments, while Emma worked on her latest story at her desk nearby. The numbers were impressive. Revenue up 200%, 15 new jobs created, over 100 families served through the community outreach programs. But the real measure of success was simpler. Emma was thriving in school, their relationship had grown stronger rather than more strained, and Marcus could look at himself in the mirror each morning, knowing that his work made the world a little bit better. "Dad," Emma said, looking up from her notebook, "I finished my story about the princess who builds bridges. Want to hear it?" Marcus saved his work and turned to give her his full attention. "Absolutely." Emma cleared her throat and began reading in her clear, serious voice. "Once upon a time, there was a princess who lived in a kingdom where the rich people lived on one side of a big river and the poor people lived on the other side. The only bridge was old and dangerous, and the king didn't want to spend money to fix it." As Emma read her story about a princess who convinced the king to let her design and build a new bridge that was beautiful and strong and brought the two sides of the kingdom together, Marcus realized that his daughter had understood something that had taken him years to learn. The best bridges weren't just about spanning physical distances. They were about connecting people across the divides of class and circumstance and expectation, creating paths where none had existed before. Outside, snow continued to fall on a city that was slowly learning to build communities instead of just buildings, to measure success in relationships strengthened as well as projects completed. And in a warm office where father and daughter worked side by side, the foundation was being laid for a future that honored both dreams and values, both ambition and love. 5 years later. The late spring sunshine streamed through the tall windows of the Lincoln Elementary School auditorium as Marcus adjusted his tie and tried to calm the nervous flutter in his stomach. He had addressed city councils and presented to corporate boards, but speaking at his daughter's 8th grade graduation carried a weight that no business meeting could match. Emma sat in the front row with her classmates, her dark hair pulled back in the French braid she'd finally taught him to master, her eyes bright with anticipation and the peculiar mixture of excitement and terror that marked the transition from childhood to adolescence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Principal Martinez announced from the podium, "this year's commencement address will be delivered by Marcus Chen of Chen Construction and the Northwest Community Building Network. Mr. Chen is being honored not only for his contributions to our school's infrastructure improvements, but for his role in developing a model of community-focused development that has been adopted in over 30 cities across the region." As Marcus approached the podium, he caught sight of familiar faces in the audience. Victoria Reed sat 3 rows back, her silver hair now cut shorter, and her business attire replaced by the kind of casual elegance that spoke of a woman who'd learned to value substance over image. Beside her, Sophia Reed Martinez. She'd married Miguel Martinez, a community organizer she'd met during one of the housing projects. Bounced their 6-month-old son on her knee, while keeping one eye on her stepdaughter Sophia, who was graduating in Emma's class. Janet Morrison, now a partner in Chen Construction and the architect of their innovative apprenticeship program, had claimed a seat in the teachers section. She'd completed her master's degree while working full-time, writing her thesis on social entrepreneurship. Her research had become the foundation for the university's new program in social entrepreneurship.
Marcus cleared his throat and looked out at the sea of young faces, each one representing someone's hopes and dreams and carefully nurtured potential. 13 years ago, he began, I stood on a mountain road in the worst storm I'd ever seen, carrying a stranger to safety through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate. I learned something that night that I want to share with all of you. Sometimes the most important journeys aren't about reaching your destination. They're about discovering what you're capable of when someone else's safety depends on your strength. He paused, his eyes finding Emma's face in the crowd. She was listening with the intense focus she brought to everything that mattered to her, the same expression she'd worn when mastering long division and later when designing her reward-winning science fair project on sustainable building materials. Every one of you is about to begin a journey that will test your limits and challenge your assumptions about what's possible. You'll face storms that seem insurmountable and paths that appear to lead nowhere. But I want you to remember that every bridge was once just an idea, every building was once just a dream, and every community was once just a group of strangers who decided to help each other. The applause was warm and sustained, but Marcus barely heard it. His attention was focused on Emma, who was wiping tears from her eyes while maintaining the kind of dignity that reminded him so much of her mother. After the ceremony, she found him in the crowd of families taking pictures and threw her arms around his waist. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said, her voice slightly muffled against his chest. "I'm proud of you too, kiddo. Ready for high school?" Emma pulled back to look at him, her expression serious despite the celebratory chaos around them. "Dad, I've been thinking about what I want to study. I still want to be an engineer, but I want to focus on sustainable architecture, buildings that help communities instead of just housing them." Marcus felt his chest tighten with pride and something that might have been awe. At 13, Emma had already grasped concepts that had taken him decades to understand. "That sounds perfect," he said. "The world needs more builders who think about people first." "Mr. Chen," a young man appeared at his elbow, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of earnest intensity that marked him as either a journalist or a very dedicated salesperson. "I'm David Kim from the Seattle Times. I'm working on a feature story about the community building network, and I was hoping I could ask you a few questions." Marcus glanced at Emma, who nodded encouragingly. Over the years, she'd become remarkably comfortable with the occasional media attention that followed their success, treating reporters as potential allies and spreading awareness about sustainable development rather than intrusions on their privacy. "Of course," Marcus said, "but let's find somewhere quieter." They moved to an empty classroom where David Kim spread out his notes and recording equipment with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Chen, it's been 5 years since that night on the mountain that started all of this. Looking back, did you ever imagine it would lead to the kind of impact the network has achieved?" Marcus considered the question while watching Emma through the classroom window as she posed for pictures with her friends. "Honestly, I was just trying to get an injured person to medical care. I wasn't thinking about changing the construction industry or revolutionizing community development. I was thinking about getting home to my daughter." "But the network has now completed over 500 community projects, created more than 800 jobs, and pioneered a model that's being studied by urban planning programs around the world. That's not an accident." "No," Marcus agreed.
But it's not the result of some grand master plan either. It's what happens when you consistently choose to do the right thing, even when it's difficult or expensive or inconvenient. Success isn't about having a brilliant strategy. It's about having clear values and the courage to act on them.
David Kim scribbled notes furiously. Speaking of values, there's been some criticism that the network's model is too idealistic for large-scale implementation. How do you respond to those who say that prioritizing community benefit over profit margins isn't sustainable in a competitive market? Marcus laughed, a sound without bitterness that carried the confidence of someone who'd been proving skeptics wrong for years. 5 years ago, I was a one-man construction company operating out of my apartment, struggling to pay my daughter's school fees. Last month, the network completed a $50 million mixed-use development in Portland that includes affordable housing, community health centers, and green spaces, all while maintaining a 15% profit margin and creating 200 permanent jobs. The idealistic approach, as it turns out, is also the profitable one when you think long-term instead of quarterly. What's next for the network? Before Marcus could answer, Emma appeared in the classroom doorway. "Dad, Mrs. Reed wants to know if we're still coming to dinner Sunday. She's making that pasta thing you like." David Kim looked between father and daughter with obvious curiosity. The relationship between the working-class contractor and the billionaire CEO had been the subject of considerable speculation over the years, with theories ranging from secret romance to elaborate business conspiracy. The truth was simpler and more complex than either narrative suggested. "Tell her yes," Marcus said, "and remind her that you're bringing your volcano project to show Miguel's kids." After Emma left, David Kim leaned forward with renewed interest. "Your relationship with the Reed family has evolved considerably over the years. How would you characterize it now?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how to explain something that defied easy categorization. "Victoria Reed and I come from different worlds, but we've learned that we share the same values about what building really means. It's not just about creating structures, it's about creating communities. Sophia has become, well, she's family now. She's Emma's godmother, my closest business partner, and one of the few people who understands what it's like to balance personal relationships with professional responsibilities. Are you suggesting there's a romantic element to—" "I'm suggesting," Marcus interrupted gently, "that some relationships transcend the categories people try to put them in. Sophia and I work well together, we trust each other completely, and we both prioritize Emma's well-being above everything else. Whether that looks like romance or friendship or business partnership from the outside doesn't really matter to us." 3 years later. The morning of Sophia's wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline mountain air that made every color seem more vivid and every sound carry farther than physics should allow. Marcus stood at the bathroom mirror in his hotel room, struggling with his tie for the 3rd time when Emma knocked on the connecting door between their rooms. "Dad, Sophia wants to know if you have a minute. She's kind of freaking out." Marcus abandoned his tie and followed Emma down the hall to the bridal suite, where he found Sophia sitting on the edge of the bed in her slip and robe, staring at her wedding dress with the expression of someone contemplating a particularly challenging engineering problem. Her hair was half-styled, her makeup perfect except for the slight smudging around her eyes that suggested recent tears. "Hey," Marcus said softly, settling into the chair across from her. "What's going on?" "I'm being ridiculous," Sophia said, not looking up from the dress. "It's just, what if I'm not ready for this? What if I'm too damaged from my parents' divorce to have a healthy marriage? What if Miguel realizes he deserves someone with so much baggage?" Marcus glanced at Emma, who nodded and quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Over the years, his daughter had developed an intuitive understanding when adults needed privacy to work through complicated emotions. "Sophie?" Marcus said, using the nickname that had evolved during their years of friendship and partnership. "Do you love Miguel?" "Desperately," she replied without hesitation. "Does he love you?" "He says he does." "Do you trust him?" Sophia finally looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "More than I've ever trusted anyone except you and Emma." Marcus leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. "Then Here's what I learned from my marriage to Sarah. Love isn't about being perfect or having no baggage or deserving anything. It's about choosing to build something together that's stronger than what either of you could create alone. Miguel isn't marrying your resume or your bank account or your family history. He's marrying you, the woman who spent 3 years learning Spanish to communicate better with his kids, who volunteers at the community center every Tuesday, who cries during Disney movies and laughs at dad jokes and fights for affordable housing like her life depends on it. What if I mess it up? Then you figure it out together. That's what marriage is, a daily choice to keep building something beautiful, even when the foundation gets a little shaky. Sophia was quiet for a moment, absorbing his words. Then she smiled, the first genuine expression of joy he'd seen from her all morning. You know, for someone who claims not to be romantic, you give pretty good relationship advice. I had a good teacher, Marcus said, thinking of Sarah, and the lessons she had taught him about love being a verb rather than just a feeling. 2 hours later, Marcus stood at the altar of the small mountain chapel where he'd first met Sophia 8 years earlier. Not the same building, but the same mountain range, the same view of the valley spread below like a promise of possibility. The guest list was small and carefully chosen. Victoria Reed in the front row, tears streaming down her face despite her efforts to maintain composure, Miguel's parents and siblings, who had welcomed Sophia into their family with warmth that transcended language barriers, Emma, as maid of honor, radiant in her first formal dress, and the knowledge that her chosen family was expanding once again. The ceremony itself was bilingual and brief, incorporating traditions from both families while maintaining the kind of simplicity that reflected the couple's shared values. But when the minister asked if anyone had objections to the union, Marcus felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't jealousy exactly, though he'd be lying if he said he hadn't wondered over the years whether his feelings for Sophia extended beyond friendship and business partnership. It was more like the bittersweet recognition that another chapter of their story was ending, even as a new one began. The dynamics that had defined their relationship for 8 years, the careful balance between professional collaboration and personal intimacy, the unspoken understanding that they were both protecting something too precious to risk, would necessarily change now that she was committing herself to someone else. But as Sophia and Miguel exchanged vows they'd written themselves, speaking of building communities and raising children and growing old together while continuing to fight for justice and equality, Marcus realized that his role in Sophia's life wasn't ending, it was evolving. He would always be the man who carried her to safety on a storm-lashed mountain. She would always be the woman who saw potential in a struggling contractor and helped him build something extraordinary. Those foundations couldn't be changed by marriage or time or the shifting dynamics of adult relationships. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in cheers and applause. Emma threw herself into Marcus's arms, her face glowing with excitement and the particular satisfaction of someone who'd been advocating for this outcome for months. "They're perfect together," she whispered in her ear.
Yeah, Marcus agreed, watching as Sophia and Miguel kissed while their families surrounded them with congratulations and well wishes. They really are. 10 years later. The boardroom of Reed Industries had changed significantly since Marcus's first visit 21 years earlier. The mahogany table remained, but the walls now displayed photographs of community projects alongside traditional corporate portraits, children playing on playgrounds built by network contractors, elderly residents enjoying accessible housing modifications, young people participating in apprenticeship programs that had launched thousands of careers in sustainable construction. Emma Chen Martinez sat at the far end of the table, her architectural plans spread before her like battle maps for a war against inadequate housing and urban decay. At 28, she bore little resemblance to the 8-year-old who'd once organized her father's invoices. She was taller than Marcus now, with Sarah's delicate features but his steady hands and unwavering focus.
Her master's degree in sustainable architecture from MIT hung in the office she shared with her husband Carlos, a civil engineer she'd met during a joint project to redesign flood-prone neighborhoods in Louisiana. "The New Orleans pilot program exceeded all our projections," Emma reported, her presentation style a blend of her father's practical directness and her godmother's sophisticated polish. "We completed 36 housing units, 2 community centers, and a school that doubles as an emergency shelter, all within budget and with 85% local hiring. More importantly, the Neighborhood Association reports a 40% decrease in flood damage and a 60% increase in property values." Victoria Reed, now in her 70s, but still sharp as polished steel, nodded approvingly. Community response? Overwhelmingly positive. 3 other Louisiana parishes have requested similar projects, and the mayor of Baton Rouge wants to discuss a citywide implementation. Marcus felt the familiar swell of pride that came with watching his daughter exceed every expectation he dared to hold for her future. But it was tempered by a melancholy he'd been struggling to acknowledge. Emma was 32 cities into her own career now, building communities from coast to coast with the same passion and competence that had defined her childhood. Soon, she wouldn't need his guidance or partnership. She would be fully herself, complete and independent, carrying forward the values they'd shared while creating her own legacy. "Dad," Emma's voice cut through his reverie, "you're up." Marcus consulted his notes, though he could have delivered this report from memory. Network operations continued to exceed sustainability targets. 47 partner contractors across 12 states, average project completion rate of 98.5%, customer satisfaction scores in the top 1% industry-wide. More significantly, we've created over 3,000 permanent jobs and completed projects that directly serve approximately 45,000 families. "Financial performance?" Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. "Revenue growth of 8% year-over-year, profit margins steady at 12 to 15% across all network partners. The sustainability model continues to prove that doing good and doing well aren't mutually exclusive." The meeting continued for another hour, covering expansion plans and policy initiatives and the complex logistics of maintaining quality control across a network that spanned thousands of miles and dozens of local markets. But Marcus found his attention drifting to the photographs on the walls, each one representing a family whose life had been improved by the work they'd chosen to do. After the meeting ended and the other participants had departed for their respective offices and obligations, Marcus remained in the boardroom with Victoria, watching the afternoon sun paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. The silence between them was comfortable, the product of 21 years of shared challenges and mutual respect. "Regrets?" Victoria asked. "About what?" "Any of it. The mountain, the partnership, the path that brought us here."
Marcus considered the question seriously. The man who'd carried an injured stranger down a mountain trail had been driven by desperation and instinct, making decisions based on immediate necessity rather than long-term strategy. He'd had no way of knowing that those choices would reshape not just his own life, but the lives of thousands of people across multiple states and generations. "No regrets," he said finally. "But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd taken a different route that night, if I'd driven home instead of taking that job, if I'd called for help instead of carrying Sophia myself, if I'd been content with small contracts instead of accepting your partnership offer. Do you think you'd be happier?" Marcus laughed. "Honestly, I think I'd be dead. Not literally, but the man I was before that night was just surviving. Working enough to pay bills, caring for Emma, going through the motions of living without really building anything that would last. The choices I made that night, and every day since, they've been about creating something bigger than myself." Victoria nodded slowly. "Sophia always said you taught her that success isn't about what you achieve, it's about what you make possible for other people." Smart woman, your daughter. She learned from a good teacher. 15 years later.
The retirement party was held in the same community center that had been one of Chen Construction's first major projects, its walls now decorated with photographs spanning nearly 40 decades of Marcus's career. The guest list read like a who's who of sustainable development: mayors and contractors, architects and community organizers, policy researchers, and the kind of grassroots activists who'd been fighting for affordable housing since before it became fashionable. Emma stood at the podium, her silver-streaked hair catching the light as she addressed the crowd of several hundred people who'd gathered to honor her father's contributions to their field. At 43, she'd become a recognized authority on community-centered design. Her firm's projects featured in architectural magazines and urban planning textbooks. But tonight, she was simply a daughter, celebrating the man who taught her that building things was more than just engineering and economics. Most of you know the story of how my father's career changed direction. The storm, the rescue, the partnership with Reed Industries that transformed both companies and launched the community building network. It's become something of a legend in our industry. The working-class hero who saved the billionaire's daughter and ended up revolutionizing sustainable development. The audience chuckled appreciatively, but Emma's expression remained serious. But that story misses the most important part. My father didn't become a hero that night on the mountain. He was already a hero. To me, to our neighbors, to every family he'd helped over the years without expecting recognition or reward. The mountain just gave the rest of the world a chance to see what I'd known my whole life, that extraordinary love makes ordinary people capable of impossible things. Marcus wiped his eyes as the crowd erupted in sustained applause. Across the room, he caught sight of familiar faces: Sophia and Miguel with their 3 children, Victoria Reed looking frailer than he liked but still radiating the kind of sharp intelligence that had built an empire, Janet Morrison with her husband and twins, dozens of contractors and community leaders whose lives had intersected with his over the decades. But his attention kept returning to Emma, who was now sharing stories about growing up as the unofficial assistant to a one-man construction company, about learning that success meant different things to different people, about discovering that the best way to honor someone's sacrifice was to pay it forward in whatever way your talents and circumstances allowed. My father taught me that building isn't just about creating structures, Emma concluded. It's about creating connections between people, between communities, between the world as it is and the world as it could be. Every bridge he built, every foundation he laid, every family he helped, they were all part of a larger construction project that's still ongoing. And while he's retiring from the day-to-day work, his blueprint for building with purpose and integrity will continue to guide us for generations to come. The party continued until well past midnight, filled with the kind of laughter and storytelling that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. As the crowd gradually thinned and the cleanup began, Marcus found himself standing outside the community center, looking up at stars that seemed closer and brighter than they had any right to be in the middle of the city. Having second thoughts about retirement, Sophia appeared beside him, her voice carrying the warmth and familiarity of someone who'd been family for over 2 decades. "No," Marcus said, and realized he meant it. "I'm ready. Emma doesn't need me hovering over her shoulder anymore, and there are other ways to contribute that don't require me to travel 40 weeks a year." "Such as?" Marcus smiled, thinking of the plans he'd been developing quietly for months. "Teaching, maybe. The university's been asking me to consider a lecturer position in their social entrepreneurship program, and there's a nonprofit in Portland that works with young people aging out of foster care. They need someone to help develop life skills curricula. Sounds perfect for you." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the distant sounds of a city settling into sleep. 23 years after that storm-lashed night on the mountain, they both had traveled farther than either could have imagined, not just in miles or career advancement, but in understanding what it meant to build something that would outlast their own time on Earth. "Marcus?" Sophia's voice was quieter now, carrying a note of vulnerability that reminded him of the injured young woman he'd carried to safety all those years ago. "Yeah? Thank you for everything. For saving my life, for teaching me what real success looks like, for being the father Emma needed and the friend I never knew I was looking for. Thank you for giving me the chance to build something bigger than myself, for seeing potential I didn't know I had, and for trusting me with opportunities I hadn't earned yet. You earned every single one." As they hugged goodbye, the kind of embrace that carried decades of shared struggles and triumphs, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction that came from completing something important. Not finishing it, because the work of building communities would continue long after he was gone, but completing his part of it, laying a foundation that others could build upon for generations to come. 25 years later, the wheelchair was a concession to age rather than injury, though Marcus's 78-year-old body bore the accumulated aches of 5 decades in construction. Emma pushed him slowly through the memorial garden that had been dedicated in Sarah's honor, past rose bushes that bloomed in careful succession from spring through fall, past the bench where he came most mornings to read and remember and plan his day around the volunteer obligations that still filled his schedule. "The kids want to know if you'll tell them the mountain story again," Emma said, settling on to the bench beside his wheelchair. Her own grandchildren, Sophia and Luis, ages 6 and 8 respectively, had heard the tale dozens of times but never seemed to tire of the details.
"Which version?" Marcus asked with a smile. "The one where I'm a superhero, or the one where I'm just a tired contractor who happened to be in the right place at the right time?" "The true one," Emma replied. "The one where love makes people capable of impossible things." Marcus looked across the garden to where his great-grandchildren were playing on the playground equipment that bore his name, not because he'd donated money, but because the community had insisted on honoring the man who'd spent 50 years proving that building things was about more than profit margins and completion schedules. The children's laughter carried on the afternoon breeze, mixing with the sound of traffic and construction from the mixed-use development that had transformed this corner of the city into something approaching urban paradise. "Tell me something," Marcus said. "Do you think we did it right? The business, the family, all of it?" Emma was quiet for a moment, her architect's eyes surveying the community that surrounded them: affordable housing mixed with market-rate units, community gardens tended by residents of all ages, small businesses that served local needs rather than corporate franchises. It was the kind of neighborhood that urban planners studied and city officials tried to replicate. But more importantly, it was the kind of place where children could grow up feeling safe and valued and connected to something larger than themselves. "Dad," she said finally, "look around. Look at what you built. Not just the buildings, but the relationships, the trust, the model that proved business could be a force for community building instead of community destruction. Look at the contractors across the country who are using your methods, the families living in affordable housing that exists because you proved it could be profitable, the young people who learned construction skills through programs you developed." She paused, her voice catching slightly with emotion. "Most importantly, look at the granddaughter who grows up knowing that her great-grandfather was a man who carried strangers to safety, who treated every project as an opportunity to serve his community, who chose love over fear every single day for 50 years. Yeah, Dad, we did it right." As the sun set over the valley that had been home to 4 generations of Chens, Marcus closed his eyes and felt the deep contentment that came from a life well lived. Somewhere in the city, contractors were finishing projects that would serve families for decades to come. Somewhere else, young people were learning that building things was about more than hammers and nails. And in Portland and Seattle and dozens of other cities, the community building that were continued to prove that doing good and doing well weren't just compatible, they were inseparable. The mountain that had changed everything was still visible in the distance, its peaks catching the last light of day. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at it, remembering the weight of an injured stranger across his shoulders, the impossible distance between crisis and safety, the moment when he'd learned that love could transform ordinary people into heroes. "Tell the kids I'll share the story tomorrow," he said to Emma. "All of it. The fear and the doubt, and the moments when giving up seemed like the only rational choice. Because that's the part they need to understand. Heroes aren't people who don't feel afraid. They're people who feel afraid and keep walking anyway." Emma squeezed his hand, and together, they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, each one a reminder that even the smallest lights could illuminate vast distances when they refused to be extinguished by darkness. 50 years later, the documentary crew had been following Emma Chen Martinez for 6 months, documenting the legacy of sustainable community development that had grown from a single act of courage on a storm-lashed mountain 5 decades earlier. Now 93, and the last surviving member of the original partnership that had transformed American construction practices, Emma sat in her study surrounded by photographs and blueprints that told the story of a movement that had outlived its founders.
"People ask me what my father would think of the world we've built," Emma told the interviewer, her voice still strong despite her age. "They want to know if he'd be proud of the fact that community-centered development is now standard practice, that affordable housing requirements are written into building codes, that contractors compete on sustainability metrics instead of just lowest bidder." She paused, her eyes finding the photograph on her desk. Marcus at 35, muddy and exhausted, but smiling as he held 2-year-old Emma outside their first real office space. "But I think he'd be more interested in the small things. The fact that his great-great-granddaughter, Sophia, is studying engineering because she wants to design buildings that help communities thrive. The fact that there are now children playing in playgrounds across the country who will never know what it's like to live in neighborhoods without safe housing and green spaces and economic opportunity. The fact that a working-class contractor from a small mountain town proved that ordinary people can change the world by refusing to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be." The interviewer leaned forward. "What do you think was the key to your father's success? What made him different from other contractors of his generation?" Emma smiled, her weathered hands folding over each other in her lap. "He understood something that took the rest of the industry decades to learn, that building things isn't about imposing your vision on a community. It's about listening to what people need and figuring out how to make it possible. He carried Sophia Reed to safety not because he had a plan or a strategy, but because walking away wasn't an option. Everything that came after, the partnerships, the innovations, the transformation of how we think about development, all of that grew from that single moment of choosing love over fear. And that's a choice anyone can make? That's a choice everyone must make," Emma corrected gently. "Every day, in small ways and large ones. The contractor who chooses quality over shortcuts, the developer who includes affordable units even when they're not required, the neighbor who helps with home repairs, the child who shares their toys with someone who has fewer. Building communities isn't just about construction, it's about construction of relationships, of trust, of the kind of world we want to leave for the people who come after us." The interview continued for another hour, covering the technical innovations and policy changes that had grown from Marcus Chen's work. But as the crew packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, Emma remained in her study, surrounded by the accumulation of a lifetime spent continuing her father's mission. On her desk, beside the photograph of Marcus, sat a letter from Sophia Chen Rodriguez, Emma's great-granddaughter, postmarked from the engineering program at Stanford. The letter described Sophia's thesis project, a new approach to disaster-resistant housing for low-income communities, and included a simple line that brought tears to Emma's eyes. "I want to build things that help people, just like great-great-grandpa did." Outside her window, the city sparkled with lights that illuminated neighborhoods where families of all backgrounds lived in dignity and security, where children grew up believing that their dreams were achievable, where the distance between crisis and safety had been shortened by generations of people who'd learned that carrying each other was not just possible, but essential. And somewhere in the mountains, on a road that had long since been improved and made safe,
A historical marker told the story of the night when everything changed, when a working-class contractor named Marcus Chen proved that love could move mountains one careful step at a time.